Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Today we are exploring how to digitally build Britain. In recent years, there has been an emphasis on how infrastructure can be designed and maintained through digital platforms. Today, I am joined by Marek Suchocki, Infrastructure Industry Engagement Lead at Autodesk. In 2017, the government launched Digital Built Britain that was a partnership between the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, BEIS, and Innovate UK to create a digital economy for infrastructure, buildings and services. So why is digital infrastructure so important?
Thank you, Justin. The digital infrastructure is really a new paradigm that we've entered into within the global industries, but construction industry has perhaps lagged in adoption of new technologies and stuck to traditional means for communication, collaboration, contractual exchange. So when we try to feed the outcomes and the outputs from our delivery of built assets, we need to, let's say, step up and join the rest of the world in doing things digitally. I would say that that's probably the big focus behind the idea of a digital built Britain. Is it's a collection of all the digital records and information, irrespective of what industry they've come from, that we can then relate and use in the operation, management and exploitation of our built and even natural assets.
It reminds me of a survey, I think, a number of years ago, where certain sectors, such as financial services, they'd really digitalized their whole business, whereas construction was much further down the line. And I think perhaps is cost of construction and trying to reduce these has long been an ambition of governments, and I deliberately use the plural. So what can digital platforms do to bring costs down, and will digitalization in effect be the game changer for cost reduction in construction industry?
Interesting question, and I take your point about the lag that our industry has seen to other sectors. I believe hunting and fishing are the only one that have been slower at adoption of new technology. I think the emphasis or need to digitalize or embrace digital technologies is there from many different perspectives. We've had reports over the decades going back through to Simon's report in the 40s, Banwell in the 60s, Latham and Egan in the 90s, all citing inefficiencies in how we procure and construct and also operate our industry. 10 years ago, we had the Never Waste a Good crisis, the Wolstenholme report, which talked about how we come out of the financial troubles of the late noughties. And at the heart of a lot of the more recent things is the potential that we can get from adopting digital solutions and digital workflows to enhance services and improve productivity. I suppose the current situation that we're in with COVID-19 means that our industry is facing perhaps an existential crisis, and also looking at what we do next. Just recently, the Construction Leadership Council, in fact this week, have prepared a recovery plan for the construction industry, and they've phased it in three different chunks. Really. The first one is restart, get the industry working again. Then it's reset. So the first phase is up to the next sort of 3 months once we come slowly out of the lockdown phase, then reset over 3 to 12 months. Let's look at the demand and pipeline. What productivity changes do we need to implement? And look at professionalism. What are the investments we need to make in working differently? Then finally, they talk about a reinvent phase for maybe 12 months out from where we are today. And I think that's probably the one that's going to be the most likely to focus on those digital built Britain ideas, leveraging digital and new manufacturing technologies, addressing carbon targets, building better quality outputs and outcomes for us as taxpayers, particularly from the public sector projects. But in general, I think we have an opportunity to transform as an industry. This is not going to be done in any isolation. So it will be a partnership across clients, the constructors, the contractors, design consultants, other suppliers and specialists in our industry, and including companies like my own, where we're a technology firm that provides some of the enabling tools and processes to do things differently as we kind of reinvent our industry.
So there has been an evolution of technologies that people will have witnessed over the last 50 years, but particularly in construction, as I understand it, there was obviously draftsmen would have drawn by hand originally, and then things would have evolved to CAD that was popular at the time, but things have moved beyond that now. But the awareness of that within the industry is maybe not as complete as it could be. So could you just talk briefly about the evolution of the technologies and where things have got to now and perhaps where they're going in the future as well?
Yes, Justin. I was trained as a civil engineer in the late 80s, and I had to go out and buy some ink pens and learn how to be a paper-based draftsman. And when I started in my first jobs, I was working on drawing boards, but I was already also being given access to CAD, so computer-aided design, or really computer-aided drafting. And I have, in my career, also done research for 4 years at Reading University into what we called now BIM, or digital design. And what was apparent is actually that CAD really is electronic ink. It's just replicating the paper-based process, and with the advantage of making changes a lot easier. Clearly, you can add more information, and there is skill in drafting to add as much detail as you can on effectively a drawing sheet. But when we move from that approach to a model-based approach, which is really what BIM is, then the objects that we are placing, whether it's a wall, a layer of pavement, a bridge, have their own intelligence. And so you can add attribution to them, or you can relate it to another database or other data set. So we know more about the design. And in Autodesk, we talk about a kind of a historic progression where we've moved from that historic era of documentation. So we document drawings, to the era of optimization, which is where we have models, which we can optimize maybe the structure by doing some structural analysis. We can apply maybe a computational fluid dynamics approach to simulate perhaps how a fire might progress through a train station, for example. And that's all because we have a model. And when you have a model, you can then do other things on top of it. We're now talking about being in the era of connection. We're all on the internet. I'm speaking to you now using a Teams meeting approach. So we're finding that everybody is connected together, and we can expand on that era of optimization to say, let's use models, but let's connect teams, let's connect participants so they can collaborate on the design decisions in real time. And so I feel that if you haven't yet made the step from CAD to BIM, then you must do that today, because there are huge productivity opportunities for everyone who does this. But once you've got comfortable with that BIM-based working, that optimization opportunity, then there's this new step forward, which is this connection. And that really will enable us to move into those digital twins where many federated data sets are all linked together with multiple data owners and users able to access this kind of data lake, or this mixture of information.
You're the infrastructure industry engagement leader at Autodesk. So that indicates that collaboration is quite a key focus, I guess, of your role. And you were also involved in the British Standard B555 technical committee that has authored the UK BIM guidance that has now been adopted as an international ISO standard. Could you just explain a bit about what BIM is and where you see it developing and how it's helpful for the industry?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. So when we talk about kind of a digital built Britain, it has to start from somewhere. And at the heart of that is good, trusted, structured digital data. And the acronym BIM stands for Building Information Modeling. Myself and many others have always said the building here is a verb, not a noun. So it refers to the process of construction and constructing an information model. So if you're going to leverage good data in the future, you need to ask for what you need at the beginning to get what you want at the end. So start with the end in mind is a kind of philosophical approach. And then we can start preparing good digital records throughout the life cycle of an asset development, from planning through design, construction, and then as we hand back that data to the client that has asked for it. In fact, the term hand back rather than hand over is because, particularly in infrastructure, we almost inherit a piece of infrastructure as designers and constructors during the project. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say it was a modification to a section of motorway or a new junction improvement. The client should have good asset records already, which they hand over to us to use as a basis to commence our planning, our optioneering, which we would then agree with all the suitable and appropriate stakeholders to then progress into a detailed design, construction, and again, hand back both the project and that data for the operation and maintenance of this new asset. And I think this idea of how do we do this seems complicated. I've never heard of BIM. I don't know how to do BIM. How can the UK government put out a BIM mandate for April 2016 as we did and find that the industry is confused, uncertain, not experienced in doing this? So that's what we did in the British Standards Committee, is that we, in cooperation with numerous stakeholders, including BEIS, as you've mentioned, as well as the industry itself, began to try to codify what constitutes good around BIM. So whether it's BIM in capital projects leading to BIM in operations, good behaviours around securing digital records. So you have a security-minded approach to sharing information. We don't just put it out there. And trying to also educate the client, the requester, so that they know how to make good information requests at the beginning to be prepared and sent to them by the suppliers during the capital phase and obviously again into operation of those built assets.
One final observation I've had is we're getting a bigger focus on asset management, so data in operations, and the standards that are around BIM talk about moving from capital projects into operations and how we manage information in operations. And I would argue that we in the infrastructure industry have been very conscious of the value of good asset management. Our delivered assets, so the road, the rail, the water utility, that is the business. If a road has a massive pothole, the road does not function. We're in this COVID crisis. Many of us are still able to function despite being at home, because our business, whether it's an institution or a software company, the buildings that our offices were not critical to us. But obviously, if the railway line has a subsidence or something else, then the business is not functioning. So we have managed our assets well. We've got geospatial systems and other data records that are used to manage and maintain those assets. What we need to do now is improve the flow of information from the capital project into operations and start with the end in mind. If we know what type of data we can and should hold, then let's make sure we embed that in the design and planning processes as well as construction to then hand over good, rich data that will help us manage and maintain those infrastructure assets more effectively.
I quite like the expression that's in the industry now, a digital twin, almost like there's a virtual world that you can interrogate that's based on the digitized information about the assets themselves. So, for example, a digital twin could be a bridge that you can interrogate to a computer system, but it also exists in physical world. So therefore you can look at maybe and how the two relate. Could you explain a bit more about that? Because it seems like the opportunities now with technology and different data sources offer that you can model things a bit more in real world environments as well. So there's a kind of pull from the real world through sensor data to the actual model, and that should influence how it develops over time. And
digital twins are a kind of a hot topic for many of us. We keep hearing about them, and there are many different interpretations of what constitutes a digital twin. For me, there's something fairly simple here at the heart. Clearly, there's a geometric representation of the asset. So you mentioned a bridge. So the bridge has a geometry, and with the BIM technology solutions that are available, we can clearly model that very well, and we can extend the information. So each of the subcomponents, whether it's the parapet, the bridge bearings, they know what they're manufactured from, what their lifespan is, what the maintenance cycles are, and link to other data sets to better inform that. But the geometry is just part of it. You've mentioned the idea of sensors. So the Internet of Things often also comes into the conversation, where we start to monitor the performance and behavior of built assets during their operation. And all of this comes together to form the digital twin. I've been involved with High Speed 2 from almost the beginning of the kind of early planning of the project. And when you speak to some of the engineering leads there, they often talk about, I think, building it 3 times. It's build it in the digital, you simulate it in the digital before you do anything in the physical, because you've effectively run your kind of virtual digital twin up front. But then when you're in operation, again, you're running the physical asset alongside the digital asset, because we need to check, is it performing the way we forecast it would? And if not, let's take on those new insights, so that when we do modifications or new construction in the future, we can take in new ideas about how such constructed assets really perform. So it's that kind of whole life view. And finally, we need to also see how it is used by the users. So us, the public, how does it behave? Is it serving our purposes as transport users? And if not, what kind of changes can we make to arrangements of trains and stations? Again, with the COVID-19 scenario, we have to do some really deep simulations to understand what it's going to be like in a socially distanced environment, both on the train and in the stations.
So the Digital Built Britain strategy was released in 2017. We're now in 2020. Are you optimistic that we're going to be heading further and further away from the fisheries and down at the bottom of the league table in terms of digitalization? Do you see a momentum that has built over the last number of years? Where do you see this going over the next 5 years?
The UK is a leading on a global basis around the concept of national digital twins. We have a national digital twin initiative in place. There's a digital twin hub, which is set up from a number of member organisations, but certainly involved in BAYS and the Centre for Digital Built Britain, based at Cambridge University, and with a membership composed of people from the industry, technologists such as myself, and many others who are trying to define what constitutes a digital twin in the first instance, what practices and principles need to be in place to create good, trusted, verifiable data, and the behaviours needed to maintain and sustain that data over the long term. A report was published a couple of years ago called the Geminoid Principles that does exactly that. And in just the last couple of weeks, new recommendations around an information management framework have come out that are up for consultation, where we look at what is practical for us to do as well as what's sensible for us to do. There's a case of, we may shoot for the moon, but if we can only get to the top of a tower, then that's not practical for us to make such massive aspirational leaps. But let's make sure we can take as many of the industry with us on such a journey, and perhaps that will involve big cultural shifts, big procedural shifts, but we need to do it in a step manner. I would recommend everyone to read these new reports, and they're all available from either the Digital Twin Hub or the Centre for Digital Built Britain. And in general, kind of get your head around it, because it's less daunting than it may appear. And I think there are opportunities and benefits for all of us.
Well, thank you for your time. That was an interview with Marek Suchocki, Infrastructure Industry Engagement Lead at Autodesk. Thank you again. I think that was excellent, yeah. Anything else you think in it?
The Grenfell report. So, post Grenfell, we had the Building a Safer Future Hackett report, and that made a number of recommendations for effectively tall buildings over 15 stories that the public sector managed. But it talks about a golden thread, and the golden thread concept is really that we can go back in time to say who made the decisions and selections, perhaps of materials. And I don't think it's necessarily to accuse people of, it's your fault. It's actually to say, what judgments did you undertake? Did you follow good practice standards? And that way we can also look at other assets that have used similar materials or similar decisions in terms of design to address them. But if we don't have the data, there's no golden thread. It stops at the end and you have to resurvey everything, which is very expensive, can be very inefficient, and in some cases it's impossible to do. How do you know what's under the road? Standards like PAS 128 have really recommended about ensuring that utility providers document correctly what assets are under the ground, because you don't want to keep digging up the road to find out that there's a gas pipe or an electric utility under there. So that idea of the golden thread really comes back again to ask at the beginning for what you need at the end, and ensure and verify that it is correctly recorded, because downstream we may need to know this information. And obviously, we don't want another episode like Grenfell, but it would be still valuable to know about maybe, let's say particular types of pipes may have a lifespan that we weren't aware of, that means that they need to be replaced. So this kind of information really all kind of wraps around itself.